In 1943, in the heart of Nazi-occupied Poland, senior Wehrmacht officers began dying in ways that made no sense. Healthy men, generals who had survived the brutal Eastern Front, commanders who had dodged Soviet bullets and shrapnel, started collapsing in their headquarters far from any battlefield. They didn't die from assassins' bullets or poison in their wine. They died slowly, agonizingly from the inside out, their organs shutting down one by one while military doctors stood baffled, unable to explain why these powerful men were rotting from within. The Gestapo launched investigations. They checked the food, the water, the staff. They found nothing. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the murder weapon wasn't in the kitchen or the barracks. It was already inside the victims' mouths, sealed behind gleaming gold fillings, placed there by the one man they trusted to come close, to reach inside, to touch the most intimate parts of their bodies. A dentist. A quiet, unassuming Polish dentist who had discovered that the perfect hiding place for poison wasn't in a drink or a meal that could be tested, but in the permanent metal they carried in their own teeth, dissolving slowly, leaching toxins into their bloodstream every single day, killing them from a place no one would ever think to look. Warsaw in 1943 was a city under the boot. The Nazi occupation had transformed Poland's capital into a nightmare of checkpoints, executions, and fear. The Jewish ghetto had been liquidated. Resistance fighters were being hanged in public squares. The SS patrolled the streets with dogs and machine guns, and every Pole lived under the constant threat of arbitrary arrest, torture, or deportation to the camps. This was a world where speaking Polish too loudly could get you shot, where owning a radio meant death, where the mere suspicion of resistance could erase your entire family. The German war machine demanded absolute control, and it enforced that control through terror. Wehrmacht officers, the men who commanded the occupation, lived in requisitioned mansions, ate requisitioned food, and enjoyed privileges that seemed obscene against the backdrop of mass starvation. They were untouchable, protected by layers of guards, by Gestapo intelligence networks, by the sheer overwhelming force of the Third Reich. To kill one of these men required either suicidal courage or impossible cunning. To kill dozens of them required something else entirely. It required becoming invisible. It required being so trusted, so essential, so above suspicion that you could stand inches from their faces, reach into their mouths with metal instruments, and they would sit there peacefully, eyes closed, completely vulnerable. Dr. Eugeniusz Wazowski was not that dentist, but the real man who did this has been lost to history, his name erased either by his own caution or by the chaos of war. What we know is this. Somewhere in occupied Warsaw, a Polish dentist made a decision that would turn his practice into a killing floor. He was middle-aged, professionally trained, with a small office that had somehow survived the occupation. Before the war, he had been unremarkable, just another healthcare provider in a city full of them. He filled cavities, pulled teeth, fitted dentures. He treated everyone, Polish families, Jewish merchants before they were taken, and after 1939, German officers who needed dental work and preferred a skilled practitioner to the military dentists. To the Nazis, he was useful. Skilled labor, a Pole who knew his place. He spoke enough German to communicate. He bowed his head. He said yes sir and Heil Hitler when required. He became part of the machinery of occupation, a cog they didn't bother to watch too closely because what threat could a dentist possibly pose? He couldn't build bombs, he couldn't shoot anyone. He worked alone in a small office with a drill and some gold. He was, by every measure the Gestapo used, harmless. But this dentist understood something the Nazis didn't. He understood chemistry. More specifically, he understood the chemistry of dental materials and how the human body processes toxins. Gold fillings weren't pure gold. They were alloys, mixtures of gold and other metals designed to be durable, to withstand the pressure of chewing, to last for decades inside a person's mouth. The exact composition could vary. A skilled dentist could adjust the formula, could add trace elements, could experiment with ratios, and if that dentist had access to certain substances that were readily available in 1940s Poland for industrial and agricultural use, he could create a filling that looked perfect, felt perfect past every visual inspection, but was actually a slow-release poison capsule. Arsenic trioxide, a white powder used in pesticides and rat poison, was not hard to obtain. Mixed in microscopic quantities into a gold alloy sealed inside a tooth, it would dissolve gradually as saliva and digestive acids slowly broke down the metal matrix. The victim would ingest tiny amounts every day, not enough to cause immediate symptoms, not enough to trigger alarm, just enough to accumulate in the liver, the kidneys, the heart. Just enough to kill given time. The first officer who died probably seemed like bad luck, a general complaining of fatigue, stomach pain, confusion. He was in his 50s. The Eastern Front was stressful. Men his age had heart attacks. The military doctor signed a death certificate citing natural causes and moved on. The second death, a few weeks later, raised eyebrows but no real alarm. The third death started whispers. By the fifth and sixth, the Gestapo was involved, interviewing staff, checking backgrounds, running toxicology on food samples. They found nothing. How could they? The poison wasn't in the kitchen. It wasn't in the water supply. It was in the bodies of the victims themselves, placed there months earlier during routine dental appointments, sealed behind gold that glinted when they smiled. The dentist continued his work. Officers continued to arrive at his practice, desperate for relief from toothaches, trusting him because he was known, because he was good at his job, because the alternative was military dentists who were often brutal and unskilled. He would examine them, nod sympathetically, prepare his special alloy, and drill. He was polite, professional, unremarkable, and with every filling he placed, he was committing the perfect murder. The beauty of the method was its patience. Unlike a bomb or a bullet, which announced themselves immediately and triggered massive reprisals against civilian populations, poisoned fillings created ambiguity. Were these men really being murdered, or were they just dying from the stress of war? The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning, fatigue, weakness, organ failure looked a lot like the symptoms of a dozen other conditions. Even if the Gestapo suspected foul play, how could they prove it? How could they protect against it? They couldn't order every German officer to stop getting dental work. They couldn't inspect every filling in every mouth. They couldn't arrest every dentist in Warsaw without crippling their own medical infrastructure. The invisible nature of the weapon made it almost impossible to counter. And so the deaths continued, slowly, quietly, one general at a time, until the method itself became a ghost story whispered among the resistance, a legend of the man who killed Nazis with gold. The occupation of Poland by Nazi Germany was not just a military campaign. It was a systematic attempt to erase Polish culture, identity, and ultimately the Polish people themselves. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Warsaw in September of 1939, they brought with them a blueprint for destruction that went far beyond simple conquest. The Nazis viewed Poles as subhuman, fit only for slave labor. Polish intellectuals, professors, priests and doctors were rounded up and executed in mass shootings designed to decapitate the nation's leadership. Universities were closed, libraries were burned. Speaking Polish in public could result in beatings. The goal was clear: turn Poland into a colony of illiterate workers serving the master race. By 1943, this policy had killed hundreds of thousands and driven millions more into forced labor camps across the Reich. Warsaw itself had become a city of ghosts, its Jewish population murdered, its Polish population terrorized into submission, its streets patrolled by men who viewed mercy as weakness and cruelty as duty. For the average Pole living under this regime, resistance seemed impossible. The Gestapo had informants everywhere. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Children were encouraged to report their own parents for anti-German sentiment. The punishment for resistance wasn't just death, it was public execution, often of your entire family, sometimes of your entire street. The Nazis perfected collective punishment as a tool of terror. If a German soldier was killed, they would line up 50 random Polish civilians and shoot them in the town square. If sabotage occurred at a factory, they would burn down the surrounding neighborhood. This created a paralysis of fear that was exactly the point. The message was simple: any act of defiance will result in mass death, and those deaths will be on your conscience. For many Poles, survival meant collaboration, or at least the appearance of it. You learn to bow, you learn to scrape. You learn to make yourself useful to the occupiers because useful people lived longer than defiant ones. This was the world the dentist navigated every single day. He had to maintain the facade of a loyal subject while harboring thoughts of murder. He had to smile at German officers, make small talk about the weather or the progress of the war on the Eastern Front, all while mixing poison into the fillings he would place in their mouths. The psychological toll of this double life is almost impossible to imagine. Every appointment was a performance. Every interaction required absolute control over his facial expressions, his tone of voice, his body language. One slip, one moment of visible hatred or satisfaction, and the Gestapo would have hauled him away for interrogation. And Gestapo interrogation meant torture, not to extract information they already knew, but to break you completely before they killed you. The dentist knew this. He had probably seen the results, the broken bodies dumped in streets as warnings. He knew the price of discovery was not just his own death, but the death of everyone he loved. Yet he continued. Appointment after appointment, filling after filling. He turned his dental practice into an execution chamber. The mechanics were simple but required precision. He would examine the patient, identify a cavity or area of decay, and recommend a gold filling as the treatment. Gold was preferred by wealthy patients, and German officers certainly qualified because it was durable and prestigious. The patient would agree, the dentist would prepare the tooth, drilling out the decay, shaping the cavity to receive the filling. Then came the crucial moment. In his back room, away from the patient's view, he would prepare the alloy. Standard dental gold alloy was a mixture of gold, silver, copper, and sometimes platinum or palladium. But his mixture included one additional ingredient measured in milligrams mixed thoroughly, so that the arsenic trioxide was distributed evenly throughout the metal. Too much, and the patient might taste something metallic or experience immediate symptoms that would raise suspicion. Too little, and the poison might not accumulate fast enough to be lethal before the victim left Warsaw or was transferred to another post. He had to calibrate the dosage perfectly, had to understand the rate at which saliva and stomach acid would dissolve the alloy, had to account for body weight and general health. He was practicing a dark form of medicine, using his knowledge to kill rather than heal. The officers never suspected. Why would they? A dentist's office was a place of routine discomfort, not mortal danger. They sat in his chair, leaned back, opened their mouths, and trusted him completely. This trust was perhaps the greatest irony of the entire operation. The Nazi regime was built on suspicion, on constant surveillance, on trusting no one. Yet these men, trained to see enemies everywhere, never considered that the greatest threat might come from the professional they paid to fix their teeth. They were conditioned to fear partisans with guns, saboteurs with bombs, resistance fighters who attacked from the shadows. They were not conditioned to fear a middle-aged man in a white coat who asked them to rinse and spit. And so they died, one by one, killed by their own inability to imagine that medicine itself could become a weapon. The decision to become a killer, even a justified one, does not come easily to most people. The dentist was not a soldier. He had not been trained to take lives. His entire professional identity was built around healing, around relieving pain, around preserving health. For years, he had dedicated himself to the delicate work of dentistry, learning the anatomy of the mouth, mastering the precise movements required to drill without damaging nerves, developing the gentle touch that put anxious patients at ease. He had taken an oath, not the Hippocratic oath that physicians swore, but a professional commitment nonetheless to do no harm, to use his skills for the benefit of his patients. Now he was violating that commitment in the most profound way possible, transforming his healing tools into instruments of death. The psychological transformation required to make that leap, to look at a human being sitting vulnerable in his chair and see not a patient but a target, must have been immense. Yet something pushed him across that line. Perhaps it was the execution of someone he loved. Perhaps it was witnessing one atrocity too many. Perhaps it was the slow accumulation of rage that comes from living under occupation, from bowing and scraping, to men who viewed you as vermin, from watching your country be systematically destroyed. Whatever the catalyst, once the decision was made, the dentist faced an enormous practical challenge. He could not simply walk into a pharmacy and purchase arsenic trioxide without raising suspicion. Every transaction in occupied Warsaw was monitored. The Gestapo tracked sales of anything that could be used for sabotage or resistance: poisons, explosives, even large quantities of common chemicals required permits and justification. A dentist buying rat poison in bulk would immediately trigger an investigation, so he had to be creative. Arsenic compounds were used in industrial processes, in metalwork, in the production of certain dyes and pigments. They were used in agriculture to control pests. Small amounts could be found in photographic chemicals, in certain types of glass production, even in some older medical preparations. The dentist likely built his stockpile slowly, acquiring tiny quantities from multiple sources over months or even years, never taking enough from any single place to be noticeable. He might have ground down arsenic-based pesticides into powder, or extracted it from industrial compounds using basic chemistry techniques. He was educated, methodical, and patient. He understood that rushing would mean detection, and detection would mean not just the end of his operation, but the end of his life. The first poisoned filling he ever placed must have been terrifying. Imagine the moment. A German officer sits in the chair, mouth open, completely unaware. The dentist's hands, steady from years of practice, hold the specially prepared alloy. He knows that what he is about to do crosses a line from which there is no return. If the officer experiences immediate symptoms, if something goes wrong, if the Gestapo connects the death to the dental appointment, he will be tortured until he confesses everything. His family will be arrested. His colleagues will be interrogated. The entire Polish resistance network in his area of Warsaw could be compromised. But he also knows that if he succeeds, if the officer walks out of the office feeling fine and only begins to sicken weeks later, after the poison has had time to accumulate, then he will have struck a blow against the occupation that no bomb or bullet could match. He presses the alloy into the prepared cavity, shapes it, smooths it, polishes it until it gleams. The officer sits up, runs his tongue over the new filling, nods his approval, pays and leaves. The dentist watches him go, his heart pounding, waiting to see if he has just committed the perfect murder or signed his own death warrant. Days pass, then weeks. The dentist hears nothing. The officer does not return with complaints. There is no knock on the door in the middle of the night. The Gestapo does not come. And then, through the whisper network that exists in every occupied city, through the coded conversations and careful rumors, he hears that a German officer has died unexpectedly. Heart failure, the official report says. Natural causes. The dentist realizes that his method works. The poison is undetectable. The death appears innocent. He has discovered a way to kill that leaves no trace, no evidence, no trail back to him. And with that realization comes a terrible clarity. He can do this again. He can do this many times. Every German officer who sits in his chair is a potential target. Every filling is a potential weapon. He is no longer just a dentist trying to survive the occupation. He has become something else entirely. An assassin, a one-man resistance cell, a weapon disguised as a healer. The psychological compartmentalization required to continue this work over months and years is almost beyond comprehension. He could not afford to feel guilt or hesitation. He could not allow himself to see his victims as human beings, with families, with hopes, with lives beyond their uniforms. He had to reduce them to their role in the occupation, to the crimes they represented, to the system they served. They were not men. They were Nazis. They were the enemy. They were the reason his country was dying. This mental framework allowed him to continue, to place filling after filling, to smile and make small talk while dosing them with poison, to send them out into the world carrying their own deaths sealed in gold inside their mouths. Say it was a form of madness, perhaps, but a necessary one, the kind of madness that war creates in people who refuse to accept subjugation, who find a way to fight back even when fighting back seems impossible. The system the dentist developed was both simple and brilliant in its execution. He could not poison every German officer who walked through his door. That would create a pattern too obvious to ignore. A cluster of deaths all connected to his practice that even the most incompetent Gestapo investigator would eventually notice. So he had to be selective. He had to choose his targets carefully, spacing them out over time, varying the dosages so that some men died quickly, while others lingered for months, creating enough variation in the timeline and symptoms that no clear pattern emerged. He likely focused on high-value targets, officers above a certain rank, men whose deaths would actually impact the occupation's command structure. A lieutenant's death might go unnoticed in the chaos of war, but a colonel's death, a general's death, those created gaps in the machinery of oppression. He also had to consider logistics. Officers who were about to be transferred to the Eastern Front were poor targets because they might die in combat before the poison took effect, wasting the opportunity. Officers stationed permanently in Warsaw were ideal because he could monitor the results, could learn from each success or failure, could refine his technique. His dental practice became a study in psychological warfare. He maintained an impeccable professional reputation, ensuring that German officers actually wanted to come to him, that they requested him specifically because of his skill and gentle manner. This required him to provide genuine, excellent dental care to most of his patients. He could not afford to have a reputation as a butcher or a poor practitioner, so for every poisoned filling he placed, he probably placed dozens of legitimate ones. He treated toothaches. He performed extractions. He fitted crowns and bridges. He did everything a normal dentist would do, and he did it well. This created cover. When officers died, there was no reason to suspect the dentist who had treated hundreds of other officers without incident. The poisoned fillings were needles in a haystack of legitimate dental work, invisible precisely because they were surrounded by normality. He was hiding murders in plain sight, camouflaging assassination inside routine healthcare. The technical challenges of his method required constant adaptation. Arsenic trioxide, while deadly, is not a perfect poison. In large doses, it causes obvious symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, severe abdominal pain, symptoms that would send a patient straight to a doctor who might detect the poisoning. In small doses, dissolved slowly from a filling over weeks or months, it causes more ambiguous problems: fatigue, weight loss, confusion, organ damage that could be mistaken for a dozen other conditions. But the rate of dissolution depended on many factors: the acidity of the patient's saliva, their diet, whether they ground their teeth at night, whether they drank alcohol heavily, which could accelerate the breakdown of the alloy. The dentist could not control these variables, so he had to make educated guesses. He probably kept mental notes on which officers seemed to have more acidic saliva based on the condition of their teeth. He might have asked casual questions about their habits, their diet, their health, all disguised as professional concern, but actually gathering intelligence to calibrate the poison dosage. Each appointment was a data collection exercise, each death a test of his hypothesis. The isolation of his work must have been crushing. He could not share what he was doing with anyone. Resistance movements in occupied Europe typically operated in cells, small groups where members knew each other and could provide mutual support. But the dentist could not risk bringing anyone else into his operation. Every additional person who knew the secret was another potential point of failure, another person who could be arrested and tortured into confession. So, he worked alone. He bore the weight of his crimes, and they were crimes even if they were justified entirely by himself. He had no one to confide in, no one to reassure him that what he was doing was right, no one to share the burden of guilt and fear. Every night he went home knowing that he was a murderer. Every morning he woke up and went to work knowing he might murder again. The psychological toll of this existence, the constant fear of discovery, the moral weight of taking lives no matter how deserving those lives might be, would have broken most people. But he endured. He continued. He refined his technique and expanded his body count. By mid-1943, the deaths had become frequent enough that the German command in Warsaw was actively investigating. They brought in specialists from Berlin, toxicologists and forensic experts who examined bodies, looking for common factors. They investigated food suppliers, water sources, even the Polish staff who cleaned German quarters. They executed dozens of people on suspicion of poisoning, often based on nothing more than proximity to a victim or an overheard comment that could be interpreted as suspicious. The Gestapo was desperate to find the source of these mysterious deaths, but they were looking in all the wrong places. They never considered dentistry. Why would they? Dental fillings were permanent, inert, made of noble metals that did not react with the body. The idea that someone could weaponize a filling, that gold itself could become a delivery system for poison, was outside their conceptual framework. And so the dentist continued his work, hiding in plain sight, protected by the very impossibility of his method. The winter of 1943 brought a new level of paranoia to the German occupation forces in Warsaw. Officers who had once moved through the city with arrogant confidence now traveled in armored cars, surrounded by bodyguards, eating only food prepared by German cooks, using ingredients shipped directly from the Reich. They trusted nothing Polish. They trusted no one. The mysterious deaths had created an atmosphere of terror among the occupiers, a delicious irony that the dentist must have savored. The hunters had become the hunted. The men who had spent years terrorizing the Polish population now jumped at shadows, suspected poison in every meal, saw assassins in every face. Yet for all their paranoia, for all their investigations and executions and security measures, they still needed dental work. Teeth still decayed. Abscesses still formed. Toothaches still drove men mad with pain. And when a German officer needed a dentist, when military dentists were unavailable or incompetent, they still came to the skilled practitioners in the city, including the quiet, professional Polish dentist who had built such an excellent reputation. The dentist's greatest protection was the mundane nature of his work. Dental appointments were boring, routine, forgettable. An officer might remember a tense meeting with Gestapo interrogators or a narrow escape from a partisan ambush, but he would not remember a 20-minute appointment to fill a cavity 3 months ago. The filling simply became part of his body, something he stopped thinking about after the initial discomfort faded. This invisibility was crucial. When officers began dying, investigators asked about recent meals, recent trips, recent contacts with Polish civilians who might be resistance members. They did not ask about dental work because dental work seemed irrelevant to the question of poisoning. The Gestapo's own assumptions about how poison worked, their expectation that it would be delivered through food or drink or injection, blinded them to the reality that the poison was already inside the victims, dissolving slowly in their mouths every time they ate, every time they drank, every time their saliva flowed. The method was so unconventional that it was effectively invisible. As the death toll climbed, the dentist faced a new challenge. Success brought risk. Every death was a victory, but too many victories would eventually reveal the pattern. He had to consider the possibility that someone in German intelligence might eventually think outside the box, might start looking at unconventional vectors for poison delivery. If that happened, if they started investigating medical procedures including dental work, his entire operation would collapse in an instant. They would examine the fillings of dead officers, test them for toxins, and the arsenic would be immediately detectable. Once they knew what to look for, they could check every officer who had received dental work, could trace the poisoned fillings back to specific practitioners, could narrow the list of suspects to a handful of dentists. At that point, arrest and execution would be inevitable. The dentist had to balance his desire to kill as many Nazis as possible against the mathematical certainty that each additional death increased the probability of discovery. It was a calculated risk, and he was betting his life on the assumption that German investigators would remain conventional in their thinking. The strain of maintaining his double life began to show in small ways. He probably slept less, haunted by the faces of the men he had killed or by nightmares of discovery. He might have lost weight, aged visibly, developed nervous habits, but he could not afford to appear unstable or suspicious. He had to present the same calm, professional demeanor every single day. He had to chat pleasantly with officers about neutral topics, had to laugh at their jokes, had to commiserate about the difficulties of wartime practice when supplies were scarce. Every interaction was a performance, and the audience was watching for any sign of deception. One wrong word, one facial expression that revealed his true feelings, and he was finished. The mental discipline required to maintain this facade while simultaneously planning murders was extraordinary. He was living multiple lives simultaneously, the loyal subject who served German officers, the skilled professional who took pride in his work, and the secret assassin who was waging a one-man war against the occupation. These identities had to coexist without contradicting each other, had to be compartmentalized so completely that he could shift between them seamlessly. The question of morality must have haunted him in quiet moments. He was killing people. That was an inescapable fact. Yes, they were Nazis. Yes, they were part of an evil system. Yes, their deaths weakened the occupation and potentially saved Polish lives. But they were still human beings. Some of them were probably relatively decent men who happened to be serving in a monstrous military. Some of them might have had doubts about the war, might have been conscripts who never wanted to be in Poland in the first place. The dentist could not know the inner lives of the men he killed. He only knew their uniforms, their ranks, their role in the machinery of oppression. He had to make peace with the fact that he was acting as judge, jury, and executioner, condemning men to death based on nothing more than the uniform they wore. This is the terrible calculus of resistance under occupation. In a normal society, such actions would be murder. In occupied Warsaw, they were survival, they were justice, they were war. By the spring of 1944, the dentist had been running his secret operation for nearly a year, possibly longer. The exact timeline is lost to history, buried with the man himself. But what we can deduce from the pattern of mysterious deaths among German officers in Warsaw suggests a sustained campaign that lasted many months. During this time, he had refined his technique to near perfection. He knew exactly how much arsenic trioxide to mix into the gold alloy to create a lethal dose that would take weeks or months to kill. He knew which teeth were best for placement, typically molars in the back of the mouth, where the filling would be subjected to maximum pressure from chewing, accelerating the breakdown of the alloy and the release of poison. He had learned to identify high-value targets through casual conversation, asking seemingly innocent questions about their assignments, their responsibilities, their plans for the future. An officer who mentioned an upcoming transfer to the Eastern Front was spared, his tooth treated with legitimate filling material. An officer who spoke of his permanent posting in Warsaw, who bragged about his role in suppressing Polish resistance, who showed particular cruelty or arrogance, became a target. The selection process was both strategic and personal, a blend of military calculation and human vengeance. The cumulative effect of the poisoned fillings on the German occupation cannot be measured precisely, but it was real. Every general who died created chaos in the command structure. Every colonel who succumbed to mysterious organ failure left a gap that had to be filled by someone less experienced, someone who did not know the local situation, someone who had to start from scratch, learning the layout of the city and the patterns of resistance activity. In military terms, this represented a continuous degradation of institutional knowledge and operational effectiveness. The Wehrmacht relied on experienced officers to maintain control over occupied territories. When those officers died unexpectedly, replacements had to be brought in from other theaters of war, from the Eastern Front or from Germany itself. This created a ripple effect, weakening German forces elsewhere to maintain strength in Warsaw. It also created fear and uncertainty among the surviving officers. They knew their colleagues were dying from something they could not see or defend against. This psychological impact, the constant low-level terror of invisible death, degraded morale and decision-making. Paranoid men make poor commanders. The dentist's operation also had an unintended consequence that worked in his favor. The wave of investigations and executions triggered by the mysterious deaths actually helped the broader Polish resistance movement. The Gestapo became so obsessed with finding the poisoner that they diverted resources away from other counterinsurgency operations. They arrested and executed dozens of people based on flimsy evidence, trying desperately to appear effective, to show progress in solving the mystery. But these mass arrests were scattershot, not targeted. They picked up random suspects, tortured them for confessions that did not come because the suspects knew nothing, then executed them and moved on to the next batch of victims. This created resentment even among Polish collaborators who realized they could be next. It destabilized the network of informants the Gestapo relied on, and it distracted German intelligence from actual resistance activities. While the Gestapo was chasing ghosts, looking for a network of poisoners that did not exist, real partisan cells were blowing up trains, assassinating collaborators, and smuggling weapons. The dentist had inadvertently created cover for the entire resistance movement, but the increasing intensity of the investigations meant that time was running out. The Gestapo might be looking in the wrong places, but they were looking everywhere, and eventually someone would get lucky or think creatively enough to consider unconventional possibilities. The dentist must have known that every day he continued was a day closer to discovery. He could have stopped. He could have placed his last poisoned filling and returned to being a normal dentist, letting the men he had already dosed die slowly while he faded back into obscurity. But he did not stop. The historical record, fragmentary as it is, suggests that the poisoned fillings continued well into 1944, even as the Gestapo net tightened, even as the risk of exposure became nearly certain. This suggests either extraordinary courage or a kind of fatalistic determination. Perhaps he had decided that his own life no longer mattered, that the only thing that mattered was killing as many Nazis as possible before they caught him. Perhaps he had made peace with his own death and was simply trying to maximize his final score. The technique itself required perfect execution every single time. One mistake, one officer who happened to bite down wrong and cracked a filling within days of placement, exposing the toxic core, one victim who went to a different dentist with tooth pain and had the filling removed and examined, and the entire operation would be exposed. The dentist was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and he knew it, yet he continued to walk. Every morning he opened his practice. Every day he saw patients. And periodically, when the right target sat in his chair, he reached for his special alloy and committed another perfect, invisible murder. The audacity of it, the sustained nerve required to keep killing under the noses of the Gestapo for months on end, represents one of the most remarkable acts of resistance in the entire history of occupied Europe. The turning point came in the summer of 1944, when the Soviet army began its massive offensive pushing westward toward Poland. The sound of distant artillery could be heard in Warsaw on quiet nights, a rumble on the horizon that promised liberation or destruction, depending on which side you were on. The German occupation forces knew their time was limited. They began accelerating deportations, executing prisoners they did not have time to process, destroying evidence of their crimes. The atmosphere in the city became even more violent and chaotic than before. In this environment of collapsing order, the dentist made his boldest move. A high-ranking SS officer, a man directly responsible for organizing mass executions of Polish civilians, came to his practice complaining of severe tooth pain. This was not a Wehrmacht officer, not regular military. This was SS, the elite of Nazi ideology, a true believer in the extermination policies, a man whose hands were soaked in innocent blood. The dentist recognized him immediately. Everyone in Warsaw knew his face, his reputation, his crimes. And now this monster was sitting in the dental chair, mouth open, vulnerable, trusting. The SS officer needed extensive work. Not just one filling, but multiple fillings. A crown, possibly even extractions. This meant multiple appointments, multiple opportunities, but it also meant multiple risks. SS officers were more paranoid than regular Wehrmacht personnel, more likely to be suspicious, more likely to have the dentist investigated as a precautionary measure. Treating an SS officer meant exposing himself to a level of scrutiny that could unravel everything. But the dentist could not refuse. Refusing to treat a high-ranking SS officer would itself be suspicious, could lead to interrogation about why he was unwilling to serve the Reich. So he accepted the patient, scheduled the appointments, and began planning what would be his masterpiece. He would not just poison this man. He would ensure that his death would be slow, agonizing, a reflection of the suffering he had inflicted on so many others. The dosage was carefully calculated, not for quick death, but for maximum pain over maximum time. The first appointment went smoothly. The dentist performed a thorough examination, identified the damaged teeth, and recommended a treatment plan that would require 3 more visits spread over several weeks. The SS officer agreed, impressed by the thoroughness and professionalism. At the second appointment, the dentist placed the first poisoned filling, a gold alloy containing a precisely measured dose of arsenic trioxide. The SS officer felt nothing unusual, experienced no immediate symptoms, left the office satisfied with the care he was receiving. At the third appointment, the dentist placed a second poisoned filling. Now the officer was carrying 2 slow-release poison capsules in his mouth, doubling the daily dose of toxin entering his bloodstream. At the fourth and final appointment, the dentist placed a crown that contained yet more arsenic embedded in the gold. The SS officer thanked him, paid generously, and walked out into the Warsaw sunshine carrying enough poison in his mouth to kill several men. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant. Within 2 weeks, the SS officer began experiencing symptoms. Fatigue at first, which he attributed to the stress of the deteriorating military situation. Then stomach pain, which he blamed on bad food. Then confusion, weakness, a metallic taste in his mouth that would not go away. He went to German military doctors who could find nothing obviously wrong. His organs were failing, but slowly, ambiguously. The doctors suspected poisoning but could not identify the source. They tested his food, his water, even exhumed and tested recent meals. They found nothing. The SS officer continued to decline, losing weight, losing coherence, his skin taking on a grayish pallor characteristic of heavy metal poisoning. Within 6 weeks of his final dental appointment, he was bedridden. Within 8 weeks, he was dead. The cause of death was listed as organ failure of unknown origin, possibly stress-related. The Gestapo launched another investigation, interviewed everyone who had contact with the officer in his final months, and once again failed to identify the dentist as a suspect. The medical examinations of the body never thought to test the dental work. Why would they? Gold fillings were inert, harmless, a routine part of dental care. The death of this particular SS officer sent shockwaves through the German command in Warsaw. He had been important, connected, a rising star in the Nazi hierarchy. His death could not be easily dismissed as coincidence or natural causes. The investigation intensified to a level that made the dentist realize his time was almost up. Gestapo agents began interviewing everyone, not just people connected to recent victims, but anyone who had provided services to German personnel in the past year. Dentists were now on the list of people to be questioned. The net was closing. The dentist had to make a choice. He could flee, try to disappear into the chaos of Warsaw as the Soviet advance continued, hope to survive until liberation. Or he could stay, continue his work until the moment they came for him, maximize his body count before the inevitable end. The choice he made reveals everything about who he had become during the occupation. He stayed. He opened his practice the next morning and waited for the next patient. The final weeks of the dentist's operation unfolded against the backdrop of the Warsaw Uprising, which began on August 1st, 1944. The Polish Home Army, the main resistance organization, launched a coordinated rebellion against the German occupation, expecting Soviet support that never came. The city exploded into street-by-street combat. Barricades went up. German tanks rolled through neighborhoods, firing into buildings. The Luftwaffe bombed entire districts into rubble. In this apocalyptic chaos, normal life became impossible. Shops closed, services stopped. The careful routines of occupation collapsed into total war. Yet incredibly, some German officers still sought dental care, still needed treatment for broken teeth or infections caused by the fighting. The dentist, if he had managed to keep his practice operational in the early days of the uprising, would have found himself in an impossible situation. The city was dying around him, and he was still placing poisoned fillings in the mouths of men who might be killed by a sniper or a grenade before the arsenic ever took effect. The absurdity of continuing his methodical assassination campaign while buildings burned and civilians were massacred in the streets must have been overwhelming. What happened to the dentist in the final days is unknown. The historical record goes silent. We do not know if he was killed in the uprising, executed by the Gestapo after finally being discovered, or if he somehow survived and disappeared into the post-war chaos, taking his secret to the grave. What we do know is that the Gestapo never publicly announced solving the case of the mysterious poisonings. There was no trial, no propaganda victory where they paraded a captured assassin before the cameras. This suggests one of three possibilities. First, that the dentist died before they identified him, killed in the fighting or the mass executions that followed the uprising's failure. Second, that he was discovered but executed quietly, without fanfare, because revealing his method would have caused panic among all German personnel who had received dental work in occupied territories. Or third, and most tantalizingly, that he was never caught at all, that he survived the war and lived out his life in anonymity, one of history's most successful assassins whose identity was known only to himself. The impact of his work extended far beyond the immediate death toll. The exact number of German officers killed by poisoned fillings will never be known with certainty. Estimates based on unusual death patterns in Warsaw between 1943 and 1944 suggest anywhere from a dozen to possibly as many as 50 victims, though the higher numbers are speculative. What matters more than the precise count is the psychological and operational impact. The paranoia created by the unexplained deaths degraded German effectiveness at a critical moment in the war. Officers who should have been focused on suppressing the resistance or preparing defenses against the Soviet advance were instead worried about invisible threats, jumping at shadows, trusting nothing and no one. The resources devoted to investigating the poisonings, the time and manpower wasted chasing false leads, the damage to morale caused by the inability to protect high-ranking personnel from an unseen enemy, all of these factors weakened the occupation at exactly the moment when strength and cohesion were most needed. The method itself, the weaponization of dental care, represents one of the most creative and audacious assassination techniques in the history of warfare. It required deep technical knowledge, absolute psychological control, and a willingness to operate in complete isolation without support or recognition. The dentist could not brag about his kills, he could not share his triumphs with comrades. He could not even be certain his work was effective until he heard through rumors that another officer had died mysteriously. He worked in a vacuum of feedback, guided only by his own calculations and his faith that the chemistry would work as planned. And it did work. For months, possibly over a year, he killed with impunity, hiding his murders inside routine medical care, exploiting the one area where even the paranoid Nazis lowered their guard. It was intimate warfare, conducted inches from the victims' faces, requiring him to look them in the eye while dosing them with death. The legacy of the poisoned fillings extends into the present day as a reminder that resistance can take forms that seem impossible or absurd until someone actually does them. The dentist could have done nothing. He could have kept his head down, treated German officers to earn money and stay alive, and waited for the war to end. No one would have blamed him. Survival under occupation was heroic enough. But he chose a different path. He chose to fight using the only weapon available to him, his professional skills and his knowledge of chemistry and human biology. He turned his healing hands into instruments of death and waged a secret war that the Gestapo, with all its resources and brutality, could not stop. Whether he survived to see liberation or died in the ruins of Warsaw, whether his name is lost forever or hidden in archives we have not yet discovered, his actions stand as testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments of history, even under the most oppressive regimes, individuals can find ways to resist, to fight back, to refuse submission. The Warsaw Uprising lasted 63 days before it was crushed. The Polish Home Army fought with desperate courage, but without Soviet support, and facing overwhelming German firepower, the outcome was inevitable. By early October 1944, the city had been systematically destroyed. Hitler had ordered Warsaw to be razed to the ground as punishment for the rebellion, and German engineers went district by district, building by building, planting explosives and demolishing what remained after the fighting. The city that had been the heart of Polish culture and resistance became a landscape of rubble and corpses. Over 200,000 civilians were killed during the uprising, and its aftermath, many of them executed in mass shootings. The survivors were deported to concentration camps or forced labor. When the Soviets finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, They found a ghost city, 90% destroyed, inhabited only by a few thousand survivors, hiding in cellars and ruins. If the dentist had still been in Warsaw during this final destruction, his practice would have been obliterated, along with everything else. His dental chair, his instruments, his carefully prepared stock of poisoned gold alloy, all of it would have been buried under tons of rubble or burned in the fires that consumed entire neighborhoods. In the immediate post-war period, as survivors emerged from hiding and refugees began returning to what remained of Warsaw, stories circulated about the resistance efforts during the occupation. People spoke of partisan attacks, of sabotage operations, of the brave men and women who had fought in the Uprising. But the story of the dentist who poisoned German officers through their fillings did not emerge into public consciousness. If it was known at all, it was known only to a small circle of people who kept the secret, either out of respect for the dentist's wishes or because the nature of the operation was too sensitive to reveal. Poland had become part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and the communist authorities were selective about which resistance stories they allowed to be told. They celebrated communist partisans and downplayed or suppressed stories of Home Army fighters and independent operators who did not fit the approved narrative. A lone dentist conducting a private assassination campaign did not serve any propaganda purpose, so the story, if it reached official ears at all, was likely filed away and forgotten. The medical and forensic evidence that could have confirmed the poisoned fillings operation was destroyed along with the city. The bodies of the German officers who died mysteriously had been buried or shipped back to Germany. The dental records that might have shown which officers received treatment from which dentists were burned or lost in the chaos. The dentist's practice, if it had survived the initial uprising, was certainly destroyed in the systematic demolition that followed. Without physical evidence, without documentary proof, without the dentist himself coming forward to claim credit, the entire operation existed only as rumor, as whispered possibility, as a story too perfect to be entirely believed, and perhaps that was appropriate. The greatest assassinations are the ones that leave no trace, no proof, no way to connect cause and effect. The dentist, if he had survived, might have preferred it that way, his revenge complete precisely because it remained invisible, his victims dying without ever knowing who killed them or how. The technique he pioneered was never used again as far as we know. The idea of weaponizing dental fillings with slow-acting poisons did not become a standard tool of resistance movements or intelligence agencies. This was partly because the method required very specific circumstances to work. It needed a target population that would seek dental care from civilian practitioners, which meant occupation scenarios where the occupying forces were living among the population rather than isolated in military bases. It needed a dentist with the technical knowledge to work with toxic materials, the psychological fortitude to kill repeatedly at close range, and the operational security to work alone without being discovered. It needed targets who would sit still and trust the practitioner, which meant exploiting the deep-seated human vulnerability we all feel when we put our bodies in the hands of medical professionals. These conditions do not align often in history. The Warsaw dentist found himself in a unique situation where his specific skills could be weaponized, and he had the courage and creativity to do it. For the families of the German officers who died mysteriously in Warsaw, if they ever learned the true cause of death, the revelation must have been horrifying. To discover that a loved one had been murdered slowly, poisoned through dental work, killed by a method so intimate and violating, would be traumatic even decades after the fact. But the dentist, if he thought about the families at all, probably felt no guilt. These men were not innocent victims. They were participants in a genocidal occupation. They were the administrators and enforcers of a system designed to erase Poland from the map and murder its people. Their deaths, even by such an unconventional and disturbing method, were acts of war against an enemy that had forfeited any claim to mercy through their own actions. The dentist was not a psychopath killing for pleasure. He was a resistance fighter using the only weapon he had, and the intimate nature of that weapon made it effective precisely because it was so unexpected, so impossible to defend against. Today, more than 80 years after the events, the story of the dentist who poisoned Nazi officers through their gold fillings remains one of the most contested and mysterious tales to emerge from occupied Poland. Historians debate whether it actually happened at all. Some argue that the pattern of mysterious deaths among German officers in Warsaw is well documented in period reports, and that the poisoned fillings theory is the only explanation that fits the evidence. Others suggest that the story is an urban legend, a resistance myth created to boost morale, a tale too perfect and too cinematic to be entirely real. The truth, as with so many stories from the darkest period of the 20th century, probably lies somewhere in between. There may have been a dentist who poisoned some German officers, though perhaps not dozens, perhaps not with the surgical precision the legend suggests. Or there may have been multiple dentists working independently, each conducting their own small campaigns of revenge, their individual stories blending together over time into a single narrative about one heroic figure. Without hard evidence, without the dentist's own testimony, we are left with fragments and possibilities, with a story that feels true, even if we cannot prove it. What makes this story resonate, what gives it power even as legend, is what it reveals about the nature of resistance under impossible circumstances. The dentist, real or mythologized, represents the ordinary person who refuses to accept powerlessness, who looks at the tools available and asks how they can be weaponized. He was not a trained soldier or a professional spy. He was a healthcare worker, someone whose entire identity was built around helping people, and he transformed that identity into a weapon against an enemy that seemed invincible. This transformation, from healer to killer, from civilian to resistance fighter, is at the heart of every resistance story. It is the moment when normal people decide that survival is not enough, that collaboration or passivity in the face of evil is itself a form of death. The dentist made that choice, crossed that line, and in doing so became something more than what he had been. Whether he killed 12 officers or 50, whether he survived the war or died in the rubble, the story of his choice echoes across the decades as a reminder that power has vulnerabilities, that tyranny can be fought with intelligence and creativity, that resistance is always possible if you are willing to pay the price. The legacy of the poisoned fillings extends beyond World War II and occupied Poland. The story has been referenced in intelligence training, in discussions of unconventional warfare, in studies of how medical knowledge can be perverted for violent ends. It raises uncomfortable questions about the dual-use nature of all professional expertise, about the fact that the skills we use to heal and help can, in extreme circumstances, be turned toward harm and destruction. Every dentist who reads this story probably experiences a moment of cognitive dissonance, imagining the tools of their trade, instruments designed to relieve pain and preserve health, being used to deliver death. This discomfort is important. It reminds us that expertise is morally neutral, that knowledge is a tool that can be used for good or evil depending on the choices of the person wielding it. The Warsaw dentist chose to use his knowledge for killing, and history has judged that choice as justified, given the context of genocidal occupation. But the existence of that choice, the fact that it was possible, should give us pause. In the decades since the war, dental technology has advanced dramatically. Modern fillings use composite resins and ceramics instead of gold alloys. The materials are safer, more biocompatible, less likely to interact with the body in unpredictable ways. But this technological progress has not eliminated the possibility of weaponizing dental care. A determined individual with the right knowledge could still find ways to use dental procedures to deliver toxins or cause harm. The defenses against such attacks remain largely the same as they were in 1943. Trust in professional ethics, background checks, regulatory oversight, and the statistical improbability that any given dentist is secretly an assassin. We trust dentists because we have to, because the alternative is living with untreated dental disease, because modern life requires us to put our bodies in the hands of strangers with expertise we do not possess. The Warsaw dentist exploited that trust, weaponized that vulnerability, and in doing so revealed a permanent gap in the armor of any society. We are all vulnerable to the people we trust to care for us, and that vulnerability cannot be eliminated, only managed through social norms and institutional safeguards that usually, but not always, hold. The story ends where it began, in mystery and silence. We do not know the dentist's name. We do not know his face. We do not know if he lived to see Poland liberated or if he died in the ruins of Warsaw. What we know is that somewhere in the chaos of World War II, a man decided that he would not be helpless, that he would fight back using the only weapon he possessed, and that he would wage his war in the most intimate way possible, placing death inside the mouths of his enemies and sending them out into the world carrying their doom sealed in gold. Whether the story is completely true or partially legendary, it serves as a reminder that resistance is not always loud, not always obvious, not always conducted with guns and explosives. Sometimes resistance is quiet, methodical, invisible. Sometimes it happens in the silence of a dental office, in the careful mixing of an alloy, in the precise placement of a filling that looks innocent but carries within it the slow certainty of death. And sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that are never acknowledged, never celebrated, never known to anyone, except the person who achieved them and the ghosts of the enemies they destroyed.